Welcome, everybody. This topic that we're talking about is games with historical settings, which is a very, very broad topic for a lot of us. So it's talking about designing and playing. But what I'm going to do is kind of throw one thing out as we do our introductions. And with the introduction, I'd like everybody to kind of state, what is your favorite historical setting that you like to be working in? And we'll just start from the top of the list that I have. So that would put Stanley, you're up first. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what's your favorite setting?
Thank you, Dan. My name is Stanley Wheeler. I write fantasy books, Flintlock Fantasy, the Tomahawks and Dragonfire series, as well as some books in other genres. And I've had a habit of creating role-playing and strategy and skirmish games. I got started in that when I was very little, and it's just something that has stayed with me, and I have never grown up. With regard to my favorite setting, I would have to say Napoleonics. That is where I do most of my gaming. That's kind of the setting I like, both for strategy games as well as skirmish games.
Okay. Thank you. Keith Haus, tell us a little bit about yourself and what do you consider your favorite kind of setting to work with?
Well, I'm Keith Haus, and my wife just left, so sorry for being distracted. I am a historian and an anthropologist who studies intercultural history, and that's how cultures interact, and how video games work within that. So I just finished a book, and I'm trying to find an artist and all that, about elf and an engineer hunting monsters in Victorian England. So that should be that's a good place. But I enjoy, lots of different cultural settings. Native American culture, for instance. I grew up on reservations. Ancient cultures. The more ancient, the more you can make up, really. So.
Okay. And then we have Ravyn Evermore. Tell us about yourself and what do you consider your favorite setting?
Hi, yeah, I'm Ravyn. I'm the creative director for the Ravyn Evermore, which is my brand for all the various things I do from, I do tabletop streaming, currently doing 7 different shows a week, tabletop design, and professional GM, voice acting, art, a whole ton of different stuff that I could spend a lot of time getting into. But I'll just throw my link tree up in chat, and you can find all of that stuff there if you're interested. And my favorite era of history to work in for games and play games in is definitely like the golden age of piracy. I love pirate stories and nautical themes, and I really like attention to detail on like how sailing ships work and things like that. So any game that's in that era is immediately going to have my attention.
Okay, now a little bit about me. I'm Dan Yocom. I write Guildmaster Gaming, but I also write for Tabletops and Tentacles and also for Tabletop United, and I get published in some other things with short works. So I'll tell you, my favorite period of gaming is really kind of wide open because I review games for a lot of different groups, so I play across the board. Recently, I've been getting a lot more into World War I. Because of the strategy aspects of what that deals with. So now we're going to kind of get into some of the things. And one of the first things that was kind of mentioned in the description of this panel was dealing with historical accuracy versus getting a game that's playable. So this time I'm going to go in reverse order what we just did. I'm going to ask, what do you feel is the importance of how accurate the game is versus how well it plays? So, Ravyn, we're going to toss this one first out to you.
Sure. So that's a great question. And I think it has to do, for me, with suspension of disbelief. So if it's immersion breaking, I generally think it needs to go one way or the other. I really appreciate attention to detail for historical accuracy. But to use pirates as an example, if I literally had to spend X amount of time very carefully loading a cannon and then getting the cannonball put in there and then packing it down and doing all of that, that could potentially get in the way of gameplay. So I think the line needs to be when it stops being fun or it starts being tedious. That's where I think creative leeway is much much better to take than sticking to the accuracy. But up to that point, absolutely, being as historically accurate as you can. And then there's also ways to like abbreviate those things. You can still demonstrate that these things are happening or explain that while shortening the amount of time that the player has to spend on it.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I'm the type of guy that would speculate on what an arcade machine would look like in ancient Rome. So, there's a certain level of reality we have to accept. And, even if I were to get it down to the detail, I wouldn't do certain things like use lead paint or use lead as a seasoning in the food, just because I don't want to kill anybody. I once got my Cub Scouts to portray themselves as Roman soldiers to earn their badges, and at the end we had this big battle. And you know what? None of it followed proper Roman procedures. None of it. But they did learn about Roman history, and I was like, you know what? That's good enough. And I think that's generally my rule. If it's good enough, we'll be happy.
How about Stan?
Well, I think Ravyn hit on the number one point, and Keith backed that up. It's got to be fun. That's the number one reason that I'm going to play a game, is because it's fun. And when I was younger, I really wanted things to be more accurate. I wanted it to recreate as much from the time period as I could. And then eventually I played, I think it's called Struggle of Nations, which is the Napoleonic campaign in Saxony. This is after the retreat of 1812. And, that game was pretty much unplayable for me. There was not a lot of fun and joy. It was all charts and little tiny hexes. And I don't think that game did very well. But, and so what I want a game to recreate for me are the things from the time period that intrigue me or that are fun to recreate, and that I can reflect with die rolls or or cards, something that will help me interact, move pieces around, get my imagination going. I like to be able to have it draw me in and let me feel like I'm doing something unique and not playing one of 100 other games.
Okay, so unique nature sounds like a kind of a universal thing to the periods. So, kind of going off of that, historical games have had quite a history of different styles going back to the time of the bookshelf games and the Fossa games and some of those, to some of the more modern ones like Axis and Allies. So, from each of your perspective, and this time we'll start with Keith in the middle, why do you think historical games have such a draw to a gaming community?
I think it's an opportunity to try to understand an era, a chance to really dig into how people would think, how they would strategize, how they would do things, without having to do a lot of extra work. Actually, while you were talking, I was just thinking about something I've been reading up on. I don't know if it's true yet, because I just found out myself, but there's speculation that there were actually board gamers assessing and planning battles before we knew about it. Unfortunately, nobody realized this and just thought they were monks who were just sitting off in some room and just rolling dice, and nobody realized that they were playing this board game, planning out the strategies and stuff, and then they'd come down and be like, well, the dice have spoken, and that sounds like a total board gamer thing. So I think it's because we like to do stuff for fun, and this is a great time to just imagine ourselves in this situation and how to deal with it without having to do a lot of extra work.
Raven?
Yeah, I agree with that assessment. Yeah, I think it's a really great way to um, kind of escape modern reality and kind of put yourself in the perspective of somebody that's from a different time or a different culture, even um, without having to do a ton of research or put in a lot of work. Um, and I think that's really what most games are. Is It's a form of almost escapism. Um, and it's just there for the primary purpose of being entertainment, fun, relaxation, that sort of thing. Um, but I think we're drawn to historical era games because we also get to learn something in the process, and you do get that sense of realism with the more historically accurate it is. Um, and again, without all that extra work or tedium. For example, if you've got a crafting system in a game where you can blacksmith weapons or armor or things like that, it's very fun to pick different types of metals and build different things with a couple of mouse clicks or a couple of buttons. But if you had to go research metallurgy and actually put in the right, combination of ingredients and look at the exact technology that culture had at that time, that would start to get pretty tedious, and it would be a lot less fun. I think there'd be a lot less draw to that, at least overall. There's definitely a certain demographic that would really enjoy that, but I think overall the market would be less there.
Can I add?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Can I add something? If you are going to make your own board game or your own video game, or just your own story, and you want it set in a certain era, we actually have books called source books, and it's where somebody else went out, found all of the information you need on a certain specific subject, turned it into English, and you just go through it and go like, oh, the Romans did have glassware, and this is what it looked like. Oh, this is what their ball bearings would look like, and this is how they designed it. So then you don't have to go do all the work. And it's like $20-$30 for each one. So it should help you out a lot when you're designing or planning anything out like that.
Oh, that's cool.
Do you have anything to add, Stan?
Oh, I always have something to add. It's just a question of whether what I have to add is useful or not.
I'm sure it is.
With regard to the question about why historical games are such a draw, the consensus seems to be is because we're lazy, but we still want to have fun. I would just add to that history is where we came from. And there are all these super great events and people from history. And we want to tap into that, feed a little bit of our ego. We want to recreate those important events. And we want to see if we can be Eisenhower or Caesar or Napoleon or Alexander the Great, or maybe just Richard Sharp or some centurion. We want to be a part of something that happened and see how we might do it differently, and maybe we could change history in our little world.
I'm going to add my personal perspective on it. Is the people I've talked to is they really like to learn more as they go along. The people I found that are more into the historical oriented games really like the context that not only are they having fun, but it is something that is they're learning from it as they go along. So that's a good thing. I think it all kind of fits together. So from your guys' point of view, what would you say is probably some of the mistakes that you've seen in the games that you've played or worked on or researched? And just jump in, whoever's ready for it, because I can see some puzzled looks there going, oh, whoa.
Don't ask a historian if something was historically accurate. My wife has a rule that if we're watching my wife has a rule: if we're watching a movie for the first time, I have to shut up because I'll be like,
"Yeah, maybe a target-rich environment."
Yeah. I think a lot of the times when board gamers are making designs, they believe that the people involved had a certain level of either knowledge or stupidity that humanity doesn't have anyway. There's a certain level of fog of war. Napoleon didn't know what the next battle would really look like. He could only plan it out as best he could and hope that he was right. There was only so many people who could figure out, the next situation. So we often, because we know in history that, the next battle happened and then this happened, we often create the board game or the game as if this is an inevitability when it really isn't.
That's a really good point. I've also seen, I can't think of any specific examples off the top of my head, but I know I have seen in other games a tendency to generalize in areas that can be insensitive in an attempt to cut back on word count or mechanics in the game or something like that, where it can kind of very much so simplify like a culture or an event or something like that in history that really shouldn't be simplified because it's a complex topic. So I have seen a lot of mistakes in treating things like that or treating cultures in an insensitive way to kind of like meet deadlines or cut corners essentially. So that's something to keep in mind too, especially when you're representing a historical people or a culture that still exists as well.
Yeah. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I can tell you that if you're in certain cultures, they will actually think certain words or certain ideas are verboten. So when you get the board game or the game from them, it won't have those certain subjects in them. Almost every World War II game until about 2 years ago from Germany didn't have Nazis in them because it's against the law. And so if you're playing Medal of Honor, you're going against these nutcrackers with mechanical guns, and they're attacking you, and they're nothing like the World War II shoot 'em up that you would play in America. And so it becomes a really interesting point where you have to talk to somebody, be like, "Oh, don't you love this level when he does this?" And they're like, "It didn't happen in my game."
Yeah.
I think that the biggest complaint that I've seen in games and in trying to develop games myself, I mean, games take something complex and try and make it simple. And sometimes we fail because we still make it too complex. And when we make it too complex, it just sucks the fun right out of it. If I have to spend all my time looking at tables or just rolling dice endlessly or adding too many modifiers, it really bogs down the pace and bogs down the amount of fun that I would have with a game.
True.
Okay, so let's kind of take a little bit of a turn here based on some earlier discussion before we started the panel, and that is going into what we would consider pseudo-historical settings. So one would be, I guess we could at least, a lot of people recognize this, Tolkien's work was kind of a pseudo-historical setting, and there's a lot of arguments that a lot of the stories were based on World War I aspects. But for each of you, like I said, it's under debate. For each of you, is there any what you would consider a pseudo-historical setting that you like to see in gaming? Go ahead and just jump in if you got one.
Yeah, I've been playing a lot of Skyrim recently. Just kind of jumping back into that game, and I think that's very pseudo-historical. It draws on a lot of cultural aspects of the Nord is a very shorthand for cultures that were the Scandinavian region and Europe and other places, and the Imperials are obviously very much inspired by Romans. So you see a lot of like hints at different cultures. And obviously, it's not actually historical. It's a completely different world and a fantasy setting. And of course, there's magic and dragons and things like that. But I do really enjoy seeing the attention to detail of like, well, based on our own history with our own cultures, this is what this group might have looked like. This is the type of housing they might have had, or the type of weapons they might have forged or created, the type of armor they might have worn, their worldviews even. You can tell that they draw a lot from actual history while making it completely fantasy and their own thing. So I do enjoy that with both like high and mid fantasy type games, where it's not actually history. It didn't actually happen. It's fiction and fantasy, but you can feel a little bit more rooted with it because it's based on actual historical cultures.
Yeah. There's actually a game series that a lot of people love, and they don't realize it was based on pseudo history. It's just the creators didn't know a lot about the subject. It's called Final Fantasy, and it was entirely because the Japanese creators were like, "Oh, I should make it medieval, and I'm going to use European ideas in it." And so it's a very Japanese look at medieval ideology and European ideas on how the medieval world worked. I'm going to throw in another one. You know how we say mana or mana? Like, oh, roll for mana and all that? That's actually an old Polynesian word. It means presence or self. And literally, I've had teachers go, okay, come sit down. Let me fill your mana. And it's kind of weird because I'm like, I don't have any magic. And the word itself has altered over the years so that when you talk to a geek about mana, they have, potions in their mind. They have all these ideas. And it's originally based on this thing from Polynesians who use it completely differently from the way we assess it. Also, sorry, I'm taking up too much time if you're bothered. Okay. There's a game called The Witcher, and it is entirely based on sorry, I was about to say Polynesian, Polish culture and Polish ideas. In fact, when the president of the United States came to Poland for a visit, they gave him a copy of The Witcher, I believe it was 2, and said, "This is our culture." So it was very, very important to them that people got to play this game because it represented so much of Polish history and Polish culture. Going back to Skyrim and Oblivion and all of that, they had a concert in Sweden dedicated to Skyrim, and it was a very cultural event for them. The president or the prime minister of Sweden showed up and celebrated it because it represented their culture so much. Even though it was about a world that doesn't exist, it just hints at Scandinavian culture.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you want to go ahead.
I was going to see if Stan had anything you wanted to jump in with.
Nothing really. I was just thinking that with these pseudo-historical settings, really your game mechanics and things are pretty much the same as in your historical games. You just have to change for magic.
Yeah.
So what I guess we'd be saying there, the pseudo-historical and the historical, the only real difference is just a switch in the setting a little bit and the storyline.
Yeah.
Okay. So did you have something?
Yeah, I was going to add, it's not so much a switch. It's like going from what actually happened to what the Europeans viewed it as happening. So, we know that vampires don't exist. We know elves don't exist. But in the minds of the Europeans, the elves were real and vampires were real. And so it's sort of the point of view from the European of that era.
Gotcha.
So if I'm catching on to what you're saying, right, there's so much of the, not so much the historical in terms of actual, but the folklore.
Yeah.
plays a big part in a lot of that.
Yeah.
And we've seen that actually in other areas too, because I know like Baba Yaga and Golems, those are all Eastern European originals that came out in a lot of other games. Okay, so as we're kind of going through this, since you guys are all gamers and you've developed some stuff and you researched it, if you had someone that was going to design a game for you, what type of game look of fear there what type of game or setting would you like to see that you feel has been not properly represented in what you've seen?
I can definitely hop in with this one. I was going to say, my default answer to that is always anything sci-fi, but we're talking about history. So for history, the same answer as my very first one, the pirate era. I don't see a lot of historically accurate pirate games out there. They're usually super simplified. Like the naval tactics aren't really there, and I feel like it's oversimplified in a lot of games to where you lose a lot of that connection to the actual history of it. There's been some decent ones more recently that have done a good job with it, but I would love to see a game that really focuses on naval tactics and the different ship mechanics that make the ship do certain maneuvers, in ways that aren't, having to tell each individual crew member to go pull this rope or tie this knot, of course. But I think there's a lot of deeper insight we could get into that, as well as things like what they do when they're not on the ocean. Like how did it work when they were on shore on these different islands? What happens after you steal all the stuff off of that ship? How do you actually get paid for it? Things like that. I did a lot of research on that for a novella that I wrote a few years ago. And I really enjoyed that. And if someone were to make a game for me, I would love to see a lot of that research put into the game.
Could I ask Ravyn, what particular tactics and that aspect would you like to see, and how would you imagine it being done?
That's a good question. So a lot of it being how to work with the wind, how to move your ship to avoid being broadsided, for example, being able to focus your attention on one side or the other with the cannons, and sort of a realistic ship damage system, where if your mainsail gets hit, then obviously your speed would drop quite a bit. But it being more like target specific instead of just general, like, oh well, our ship took some damage, and so we're taking on water and we're a little slower, and it just sort of turns it into like a more of a hit point type thing. But also how to do like joint maneuvers with other ships on the sea, how to use your lighter ships and your faster ships to scout areas, while your heavier, more powerful ships are struggling to keep up. So how you can report back and things like that. Those types of tactics I would love to see more in a game. Oddly, the only one I've ever seen that does it really well, not because it sort of forces you to do it, but it was just it made it very easy to do so on your own. Was a game called Arcade. It was an MMORPG game. It's very labor intensive for most of the game, but the ship part they did really well. You actually built ships, and you got goods that you made, and you would try to transport them from one area to another, and you had other players that would build their own ships, and they would try to steal those from you. And so you had to use actual naval tactics to avoid them, because the wind system and the types of ships they had and how you used the sails really played a big part in how well you were able to get away or defend yourself or get into a position to attack. That's the only game.
So, are you looking at a video game or a board game?
So, I had specifically in mind video games, but it would be cool to see that done in a board game as well. Probably like on a hex board or something like that. is what I would imagine that looking like.
Okay, before I toss it over to someone else, have you heard of the game Wooden Ships and Iron Men from Avalon Hill back in the 70s?
I have not.
That's when
I
you
was
might
going
want
to ask about that. I have not. And of course, it's been many years since I played it.
Yeah, it was one of their award-winning strategy games for ship-to-ship combat.
Oh,
For the
cool.
big cells.
Oh, nice.
So how about one of the others? What type of game setting would you like to see exploited a little bit more?
I don't know that this is one that I would particularly like to see, but it is one I'm curious about. And I know you mentioned World War One. I don't see a lot of World War One games. Maybe just because I don't get out enough. What kind of World War One games are there, and how would one develop one?
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll mention there recently what it is I had the opportunity of reviewing 2 games that will be coming out on the market later on this year. They've gone through Kickstarter. One of them was called March on Drinia. It deals with that particular campaign in World War One, and the other one is called Trenchfoot, which is the club name for World War One reenactors, and it uses some different aspects of that's particular to the weaponry of the time and how things were done.
Cool. Do they have German doorbells?
No, I'm not sure if I'm like
The
I think
German officers all had doorbells.
yeah, it keeps it a little bit more simplified than that in the strategy, so it keeps it moving along.
Okay, that would be cool. I mean, I'd love to see the flag system they had in World War One between the different armies, for what was allowed to be hit and what was kind of a bad idea. And they even had a flag that said, "We'd like to trade mail." There was one flag, I believe it was the yellow flag, that specifically said, "This is the latrine. Please do not hit it." And like before a certain point, the soldiers were actually getting along, and it's one of the reasons why Joie Nouvelle was able to happen, because they were getting along anyway, and they just went, "Hey, want to celebrate Christmas?" And they just all shrugged their shoulders and went, "Yeah." They couldn't do that the next year. The generals and politicians were all angry at them. So that would be a cool thing, a board game about the soldiers keeping the peace while the generals are trying to get them to go to war. But when I read the question for the moderator earlier, and I thought, what games have I not seen about? And I think Polynesian culture, Pacific Islander culture in general, isn't talked about a lot. And when it is, it's using a very the point of view that they don't know what they're doing when they're on boat. And these are people that could travel 1,000 miles and find an island almost without even trying, because they were just so well trained in finding land, and it's just part of their culture to do this. And I know I went to BYU Hawaii, and I know people who know how to do that, and they're desperate to teach that again. So that would be a really cool board game of exploration, learning about the ocean and the stars and how they were able to navigate using, all of that while carrying on food and people on your ships. Another thing I'd love to see is Australian Dreamtime, which is, if you ever actually start thinking about how it works, you get slightly high. Because, I mean, you're imagining these otherworldly beings are trying to explain things to us through the rocks and the trees in front of us. And they're sending messages to us through the dreams and through our thoughts for dance steps and things to help them with whatever they're doing. So we have to, have these immortal beings moving around, and how are they communicating with each other and to the people down below, and how is this working? And just thinking about it just kind of blows my mind. And I don't think I've seen a single game with that subject really going through correctly. And I'd love to see some African trade group. There was a trade group between Egypt and what we call Niger today, and it was very expansive. It had several cities, all this stuff. And we don't talk about it a lot. So I would love to see a game about that. Throw in Anansi and the others that traveled through those areas as well. And it would be a lot of fun. So yeah, there's a lot of cultures and a lot of history that we just don't cover because we forget it's there, or we don't know that the cultures would love for us to make something out of it.
Okay. So I think hopefully we've given some ideas to our audience participants out there. So we were talking about opening this up for questions, so it's about time for that. So I'm going to kind of kick it back to our producer there and see if we have any questions in the chat that he would share with us.
Thank you, Dan. Our first question comes from James Eck. On the topic of the less we know, the more you can make up, what kinds of elements are open to be made up, and what kind of elements should be accurate with regard to mysterious events from well-understood periods? For example, Roanoke.
Ooh. Well, first off, we do know what happened in Roanoke. They left a message that said, "Hey, we're on this other island with the natives," and most historians just don't tell you that because it's funner to not tell you. They just disappeared. But the truth is, if there isn't a lot of information, you can make more stuff up. So long as it's within the realm of reason, people will not argue against it. We'll take the ancient Phoenicians. We don't actually know a lot about them. Most of what we've got is tax code from them. They kept large libraries of taxes and whatever the term is when you buy something, a little sheet of paper. They kept it on clay, and they just have clay tablet after clay tablet of sales. It doesn't tell us a lot about the culture, but man, do we know who owns camels. Those types of periods, we are completely open, but have certain amounts of rules that you can work within. So if you know the basics, you can then have, throw stuff in. They used to use pigs as weapons. They would just have armies of pigs, starve them, and just release them on cities. And the only reason we know those cities exist is we find some of the wreckage. So, it would be really cool, but you don't actually have to be perfectly accurate because you're not going to be. We don't have any information on it.
Anybody else?
I'm thinking those Phoenician records would make for a real exciting game. The Phoenician tax code game.
Could make for an interesting trading and merchant style game, I think.
True.
Well, I'm just thinking that the less you know, if you don't know enough about the area, it becomes a pseudo-historical game, and you can add whatever you want.
Yeah.
Yep, go ahead.
I was going to say, also, I think if you do have a culture or a historical period where the information just does not exist to tell you all the details, one useful thing is to look at adjacent time periods or cultures that we do know a lot about, and use that to kind of define your parameters for what's in reason. So, for example, we don't know a lot about the ancient Phoenicians aside from their tax code, but it's pretty safe to say that they didn't have laser guns. You can kind of pull from adjacent history to know what kind of weapons they might have had, or what type of transportation they had to move all those goods that they were buying and selling and recording on clay tablets. So stuff like that, I think, when you're looking at what's within reason, that's a good trick to use for it.
So I think the good solid answer that we can all kind of mention in here is, as long as it's within the realm of reason, and if it fits to what you're trying to accomplish, that's a good rule of thumb. Okay. So do we have another question from the audience?
Yes, we do. L squared 32 asks, where would you go to find good source books?
Ooh, good question.
Throw that out to the researcher.
Usually what you do is you go into a bookstore and you say, I'm looking for a source book. They usually know what you're talking about. Amazon is useful. If you honestly don't know, go to a historian. They will find those kinds of books for you. People send us all these little letters and stuff saying, hey, this book is released. Hey, this book is released. So they'll probably know about a crap ton of, source books for you to research on. And you don't need to do too much looking for source books so that you can skip the source book search. I literally just use Amazon. Just go, okay, source book, this. And I Google it and I see, the best reviewed one, and then look for it in Amazon. It's usually there for $20-$30.
Okay. I think that's a good way to answer that. We have time for another question still. Shall I see if there's another one out there?
Yes, there is one more question. You've mentioned before, Napoleonic, World War I, and World War II eras for games. Do you think there's a point where we start getting too early for decent historical gameplay?
Too early?
Too early, like how far back into history one can go for making games.
Dude, we have video games about amoebas, so...
That's true, we do.
I was going to say, we've talked about that we've done games from the Roman Empire. One of the ones back with Axis and Allies was Conquest of the Empire. That came out with that. I've actually played games that went kind of going back into the old Egyptian, so, back into the earlier BC times. I personally don't think if you can... Well, one of the fun things might be if you're going back to the caveman times, you could actually develop your own ideas of what it was all about, and then you can get right into the pseudo-historical.
Yeah. Go right to the +2 club and the +3 rock.
All the letters are written Ooga Booga.
I was going to say, I play tested a role-playing game that was playing tribal times like that, so it was pretty good.
Yeah. There's a lot of RTS games that start you out in like a Stone Age type period, and you build up from there, that I can think of. But I would say ultimately, if you have a story that's interesting, you can make a game out of it. So it's really, I don't think there is a too early to pull from history to tell these stories and make them games and make them fun. Except maybe, before the Earth is here, if there's nothing, that you don't really have much to build a game on there. But aside from that, I don't think it could ever be too early in history to build a game on it.
Roll for Void.
The War in Heaven game.
Go that route too.
Well,
orchestrating a Big Bang, or orchestrating a creation, depending on your worldview.
Yeah. I would recommend not having a heavy story written system about amoebas. I just don't think that's going to work out. But otherwise, yeah. I do honestly. I think we sometimes overdo World War II, and this is from the point of view of a historian. I get asked about World War II a lot, and eventually I'm just like, listen, I'm German. I really don't want to talk about this stupid war. And World War I doesn't bother me as much. It's the more you research it, the weirder it gets, really. And I know people who are really into the Civil War, and Stan there is into the Napoleonic Wars, which honestly, if I were to have a game, I wish I could make a game based on the way Napoleon had board games. If a cannon fired, he'd have some kind of way to fire the cannon. If a ship moved, he would actually have a ship moving. That would be fun to, have the ship moving and fire the cannon at it. That would be a lot of fun. It's just, I think for a lot of the times we don't know how to implement the gameplay, and so we just don't make the game. If that's my opinion. And sometimes we just overestimate how overuse certain genres or certain eras, if you will.
Okay, that kind of goes back to
I would.
what hasn't been done.
I wonder if certain eras are simply more conducive to gaming than others.
I think a lot of, especially the World War II era stuff, is because certain eras get romanticized more than others, and so there's more of a market for them because of that. So I think if you can get away from that or work on romanticizing a different era, for example, I think that could help in that regard.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're winding down on our time, so we're going to have everybody just kind of tell us a little bit about what you've got coming up, when you can be reached, any last points. This time we'll start with one of our LTUE guests of honor. We'll start with Ravyn, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah. So I really enjoyed this panel. It was very cool hearing some of the stuff and getting to talk about that a bit. You can find me. I'm going to throw my link tree into the chat room there. That's got my Twitch, Twitter, Patreon, you name it, it's on there, where you can find me and what I do. As I said at the beginning, I'm the creative director for the Ravyn Evermore, which is my brand for all the various things I do. To list off the most important ones, I stream on Twitch full time. I'm a professional GM. I design tabletop games. I voice act and I do art. I do composite art and graphic design. There's other stuff too. You can check it out all out at that link. And then in regards to games, I do have a game that's available for pre-order right now, which you can build any story on any historical era on. And I'll throw a link to the shop where you can find that as well to chat. And that's me.
Keith.
If you look up Native Video Gamer is one word, on YouTube, you can find my YouTube channel, and I've got links to everything else from there. And, check out some of my videos about historical research in video games and how I try to get them to interact. And if you ever want to chat about teaching Cub Scouts about Roman soldiers or something like that, I will talk your head off, because, dude, we got those kids to Arrow of Light in record time. It was awesome.
Stan?
You can find me. I have two websites, stanleywheeler.com and stanleywheeler.blogspot.com. I do some blogging and author interviews. I have a number of books. I'm currently working on the Tomahawks and Dragonfire series, which is set during the American Revolutionary War, except we've added magic and dragons and griffins and other cool stuff. And I expect to have the fourth book out in March or April. It will be called Promise of Carnage and Flame. The first book in the series is called Threading the Rude Eye.
Okay. And I'm Dan Yocom. You can find all my stuff through my author's website, which is guildmastergaming.com. I do reviews of books, games, movies, and I write about other things all about tabletopping and pop culture. And as you can see right here, I do have several anthologies that I'm included in. So please give your support to all these great people that we've had on our panel. Go check out what they've done, and thank you for joining us on Historical Settings.